But I just want to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time. We're all in different locations. Susanna, I think, is in Colorado. Johnny, you're in New York,
Yep.
right? Excellent.
Yeah, I'm in
And
Westchester, New York right now.
just in New York. The goal for our webinars are basically to kind of get to know a little bit more about the region, its history, its wine culture, and obviously we're going to taste a couple of wines together through this session. And
Foti, you muted yourself,
Well,
Foti.
you muted.
my apologies. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So our goal here is to basically get people to know a little bit more about the region from the folks who actually have lived there, who work with the actual wine industry, who can give us a more in-depth perspective about the wines that come from that area and why they make them so special and why we should be drinking them.
Awesome.
We can start off, Johnny, if you want to kind of kick off, and we'll have Susanna also chime in as we go along.
Sure. So hi, everyone. My name is Johnny Livanos, and just want to say thank you all for joining, and also just thank you for having an interest in Greek wine. Greek wine is one of the most exciting parts, well, Greece is one of the most exciting regions in the world, right? One of the most exciting countries. I know we have a lot of Greek people on here, so we're definitely not biased at all. But, Santorini especially is a island with so much rich culture, so much rich history, and wines that are, out of all of Greece, probably the most popular and iconic. And I think in part because Santorini is a very tremendous tourist destinations. I think that it's kind of helped give the wine from Santorini an extra boost. So, really a lot of really great producers. There's over about a dozen producers on the island of Santorini. And you all should have two wines today. We're going to be talking about two wines in particular. We have the Sagalis AM, which stands for Assyrtiko and Monovasia. So that's a blend, not a traditional blend from the island of Santorini, but still one that is fantastic. They have that right there. And then we also have the 100% Assyrtiko from Santo Winery, which is a co-op on the island. The 2018 vintage is fantastic. It got a lot of really great awards this year. So we're really excited about that. Should we start talking a little bit more about each individual wine, or?
Well, how about we talk a little about Santorini. I'm sure for the folks that are joining us, I'm sure have heard about Santorini. Some of us have been to Santorini, and most of the times when you speak about Santorini, most folks think about, vacation, honeymoon, sunsets, the volcano, but very little from who I encounter with really realize that Santorini has such a magical wine culture that dates back to thousands of years, right?
Yes.
And it's such a very unique wine producing area because of its unique landscape and soils because of the volcano, from what I understand. So maybe we can talk a little bit about, in brief, about Santorini's history and background and why it makes it such a unique wine growing region in the world.
So I will take over on that because it looks like Santorini is this tiny little dot in the middle of the world, and it has not ever been a dot. You could call it a hub. It has been a center of amazing things for a very long time, and it was originally the first people. Well, there were first people we know were of the Cycladic culture. We don't know a whole lot about them, but we do know that it was one of the centers of the Minoan civilization. In fact, some people think it may have been the capital, even though Knossos recognizes that.
Interesting.
And it was then, therefore, they were the seafaring people, probably the ones that we know biblically as the Philistines, but we can't totally prove that yet, but that's the good guess. And they had this huge trading center. They were trading people that were trading largely in olive oil, but certainly in wine and the other products of the Mediterranean. But what the people of Santorini didn't seem to realize is that they were living on a volcano. And it's a huge volcano. It's 7 times bigger than Krakatoa. And in 1623, it erupted. It is a cone-shaped volcano. It takes about 20,000 years to build. And it erupted. Now, it looks like most of the people got off the island. We're not sure. Very few bodies have been found there. But at any rate, it sent out a tidal wave that was 750 feet high and destroyed everything in the Eastern Mediterranean. And in the meantime, deposited 40 feet of pumice ash on top of Santorini itself. It's probably the origin of the Atlantis myth, and probably some other stories that we could relate to it that over time became folklore myths. But when it cooled off, it got settled again. It was first settled by Phoenicians. They didn't stay terribly long. It was then settled by invading Greeks who were coming then down in a tribal way. They were beginning to come into Minoan civilization, but now they had the opportunity to really settle. And actually, because of that volcano, we had Western Indo-European civilization. If we hadn't had that volcano, we would never have Western Indo-European civilization the way we have now. It gave the Indo-European invaders the opportunity to actually take over. So the first invaders from Greece were probably the ones who are now known as Ionians. They were quickly replaced after the Dorian Wars by Dorians by a prince by the name of Theras, because the other name of Santorini is Thera. And immediately, as well as the other things, there was the wine trade. Now we know that from then already on top of the pumice stone, it was incredibly conducive to wine growing. The other main product at that time was barley. And that it became a hub with this very special wine. And over now, it was the Minoan civilization was 3,000 years ago. So over the last 2,500 years at least, there were different centers that the trade went. And it was so important that Santorini is actually the site of the first Greek ever written. And it's written in a serpentine fashion. You can still see it up in the ancient Thera, the one on top of the mountain, not the Akrotiri ones. I could show some pictures of this as we go along, but I'm talking very fast, so
Fascinating.
I can get a lot in here. Obviously, one of the first areas that it was sent to was Egypt, because we also know that the Ptolemies, the kings of Egypt after Alexander, were educated on Santorini, and some of the boys were writing love notes to each other in the gymnasium. And after the Ptolemaic days, Athens was very late in being a main port, but probably Sparta and some other places. By Byzantine times, the wine was being sent by tons, and we have the amphora and things left to Constantinople, or now Istanbul, same word actually. And then after Byzantine times, believe it or not, after Christianity, one of the main ports became the Russian Empire. Now you have to remember that people of the Orthodox religion feel akin to each other. And it was almost more of a theocracy than various nations, and even though there were various language groups. So the main port was from Santorini up the Dardanelles and the Bosporus to the Black Sea, which, by the way, is called the Black Sea not because of its color, but because it's bowl-shaped and is so dangerous that it killed so many ships and sailors. Oh. And from there, that's why it's called the Black Sea. And then of course, Bezos, who was settled, a Greek person went out and settled the hub there, and it became Bezos was the name of the prince, and that's the origin of the word Byzantine. And that was settled in 600 BC. So from there, anyhow, the wines went to Odessa and to the czars of the Russian Empire. The wine trade collapsed then in 1917 and went through a terrible period. This is probably not the first time the wine trade had gone through terrible periods from Greece, but the Santorini trade certainly. And by the time that had happened, Santorini had been taken over by Italians. There were Italian Catholic patrons, very little Turkish Ottoman influence, a little bit, but not much, which is why some of the Santorini is named Saint Irene. It's Italian, its real name is Theras, and why one of the most famous wines is Vinsanto, which has to be from Santorini to be right. Anyway, took years after 1917 to get going again. About 1960, people realized what was there. But all this time, because of the cliff, and maybe you could show now a picture of the island and the cliff.
Caldera.
This pumice stone, you can't grow the vine standing up. So they're This is all the volcano. It's 7 times big. It's 16 miles from point to point in the arc, but only 10 miles in diameter. So it's very tiny to be so influential. But the vines are grown, instead of up, they're grown in a circle down on the pumice soil, and it's very, very minerally. And the reasons that it's grown like that are two. One is that it's always windy in Santorini. In fact, sometimes you can hardly stand up. It's very windy, like May is horrendous, and October is horrendous. And also because there's very little rainfall. But they're coming up that cliff over the volcano, the center of the volcano. Every morning is a huge cloud of dew. And it is the dew that these circles trap. And that is how the wine is grown. So it's everything that's grown on Santorini is intense. The grapes are intense. There's so much sugar in them that they have to be pressed overnight, or they begin to turn into a sweeter wine. The tomatoes are intense. The barley was intense. The people are intense. And that is your nutshell history. Up and now slowly that wine has definitely caught on in Athens, and from Athens internationally. There's incredible winemakers there of Greek origin. The people themselves have always been growing wine. You can show a couple pictures maybe of the traditional. I've been living there on and off since at least 50 years. So I was young.
50 years.
So I lived in a little village, and here are some pictures I took of the wine being made. Here's a wine cava. Yeah, they were rolling out the barrel. There's another one down below in that second row. That's Nikos, and that's Marcos, who plays the flute there in his striped shirt. We're rolling out we just had pressed. I jumped in and helped press, and I'm not supposed to. I'm a woman. I'm not supposed to touch the wine, but I couldn't resist. So there's a funny story about that if you ever want to hear me go into that, about what they did about the fact that I jumped in the wine cave. This is 40 days after this barrel was filled. We're testing the wine to see what the alcohol level is. And of course, them being Greeks, they all smacked their foreheads and wandered around as if it was a complete disaster. And since I had jumped in, I thought I was going to have to pay for that whole barrel. But it turned out that they then threw up their hands and said it was 14% alcohol, which is as high as you can get. And so they were thrilled. And that was a delicious barrel. I've had Vinsanto 125 years old from the barrels of these caves. And I still do when I'm there. We're still drinking barrel wine. And this is other Greek products. We're making grape pudding here. She's grinding the herbs, and then there's a pot in some picture of the boiling down of the grapes. So grapes are used for many things, in many meals, to liven things up, to sweeten things. The syrup, where we reduce the syrup to petimezi, which is, Greeks, of course, didn't have sugar. So they had honey and they had grape reduction. And that is my nutshell history. And I think then that's from Minoan times. Those were already filled with barley and wine. And they survived this remarkable thing when the volcano exploded. It buried the entire city in 40 feet of pumice. And it is the only city we have that was totally buried in as archaeology, that we can open up and see 4-story houses and how they lived. A fascinating place.
Wow. Susanna, you know a lot. That's awesome. I never knew a lot of those things. And I've been to Santorini a couple of times myself. One thing I wanted to just quickly mention is, you talk about the intensity of the island. And for those of you who are wine drinkers, one thing that's important to note is that intensity makes wines better. Wines do very well when the wine tastes better when the vines are stressed. And like Susanna mentioned, the heavy winds, the low rainfall, the fact that the soil it's not rich in organic material, it's mainly made of ash and sand. It creates a phenomenon which makes these wines taste even better, because the roots have to struggle to go very, very deep into the ground. And that way they're getting more and more nutrients, minerals, and that affects the final flavor in the final product. So what you're going to get when you're tasting a classic Assyrtiko from Santorini, you're going to have wines that are very, very high in acidity, because they naturally has low pH there. So very high acidic wines, which we know are very good when you're having food, right? High acidity helps with food pairings. It kind of cleans your palate, washes your mouth clean, gets you ready for the next sip. And also it allows the wines to age really, really long in a barrel. So other parts, really, really long in the bottle. So other parts of the world that have very high acidic wines, like for example, a Chablis in northern France and northern Burgundy, those wines have very high acidity, or in Bordeaux, you could age white wines for decades. And Santorini is no different. So definitely a very, very unique place. And due to the unique geography, the microclimates, and the terroir, you're going to have some really awesome wines. And there's one thing I wanted to mention.
Mention again that this is an indigenous grape, and it has been there for a couple of thousand years. So it was never diseased and never died out. So when we're talking about an Assyrtiko, it's a very ancient varietal, and its uniqueness is partly that. And yes, very much the pumice soil.
And some of the one of the reasons why, so you said the grapes are ancient and been there forever. Well, on top of that, Santorini has some of the oldest vines in existence in the entire world. So in throughout history, there's a parasite, this little thing called phylloxera. And for those of you that don't know, phylloxera is basically it's a louse. It like attacks the vines and it kills the plants, and it decimated all of Europe, France, Italy, Spain. All were decimated. All these vines were destroyed until they found different ways to basically adapt by grafting on American rootstock. But because Santorini is so windy and because the soil is so sandy, this parasite never made it there. It can't live there. It gets blown away. It doesn't have any way to stay and attach onto the ground. So because of that, Santorini is one of the only places in the world that has vines that are up to 100 years old. So some of the oldest vines on the planet. And so old vines, you're going to have lower yielding vines. There's less grapes, less fruit, but those fruit that is on the vines are going to be way more concentrated in flavor. So if you're tasting right now, if you have both wines open, if you're trying the Assyrtiko from Santo, it's 100% Assyrtiko on some pretty old vines. You're going to be tasting like basically history in a glass. And one of the oldest plants for making grapes in existence to create this wine that you're drinking today.
We should mention that the wine was apparently the first wine making was around the Zagros Mountains in Iran, but Greece got it very quickly after that. And so except for that very small little bit of early invention, it was Greece entirely that developed the whole wine culture. And that it's not just Santorini that has an indigenous ancient wine that had never got phylloxera. Other spots of Greece are being found all the time that have very ancient, very special indigenous grapes. But Santorini's is certainly unique and has been traded, as I said. It was recognized early on for its incredible uniqueness.
Definitely. And to your point, Johnny, I mean, there's very few places around the world that have never been affected by phylloxera. And Santorini happens to be one of those unique places that we can basically say, as you said, the vines are so natural that they continue to produce great fruit over the last 100 years, and that's unheard of in today's modern winemaking world.
Yeah. There's one other region in Greece too that has that, is up in the north in Amidion, where Alpha Estate is. They have also some very, very sandy soil vineyards. And for the same reasons, they have vines that are 90 plus years old in the northern Greece as well.
Amazing.
I think as Greeks, we like to stick to tradition. And I think by sticking to tradition, we do things well. What I love about Santorini is they're growing the vines in those circular crowns. That's the way they've been doing them for generations, for millennia. We got to trust their ancestors. They know how to adapt, and they know how they did things for a reason. And if we trust our ancestors, we're going to get a really good product in the end.
Is there
Well,
any other place?
Santorini also, the other thing is because it was so fertile as a volcano, whereas many of the Greek islands have one village and were agricultural or herding, mostly herding. Santorini had 14 villages, always, that were thriving on this, on the viticulture. And it is to this day still has its 14 villages. When I first moved there, in fact, everything with the land was so valuable that we all lived in caves. And the only building that stood up was the Atlantis Hotel. Everything else was underground. I lived in a cave for 2.5 years.
How was that? Good.
Were you going to ask something?
Yeah. So, is there any place outside of Santorini that actually their vines grow in a similar fashion, or is it just in Santorini? Because I haven't come across any.
I haven't seen anything else like it, but there's one region that comes to mind is like in the southern Rhone Valley. It's very, very windy, rocky, and dry. So they have to do stuff to protect their vines from the wind.
Yep.
But I don't think they grow it like a nest like in Santorini.
And that's natural. That whole wire basket formation is basically the vines, as you mentioned, protecting themselves from the high winds through the high wind season. So the fruit pretty much stays on the interior of this wire basket.
It's almost like they train it with
catches
itself.
the dew.
Yeah,
catches the dew as well, and that's its only moisture. It entraps the dew in the morning.
Got it. Wow.
Yeah, 'cause it never rains there, so that's how they get their water. But yeah, the winemakers, or the vineyard managers, they'll basically kind of like wrap or weave the vines with itself. So they'll help train it. They'll help move it where to go as it's growing.
Yeah.
If they leave it on its own, it'll just kind of grow like sprawl out. They kind of help it do its job, and then it helps protect it from both the wind and also help collect the dew. They also try to grow their clusters inside, almost like a little nest to protect it, like a natural barrier.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And they have a special little knife that has wooden handle and then a pounded metal, almost like a little hook on it.
Right.
Only about maybe 4 inches long, and that's how they use to train it and cut it and move it back in. So they all have them in their pockets.
As far as the island in general, small island, very small yields, very little fertile soil for grape growing in general compared to the rest of the wine growing regions of the world. The main variety, though, that everyone seems to kind of connect with is the white variety called the Sirtico. And I think that's the lion's share of production in the island, correct?
Yes. So in order to be considered Santorini wines, so you can't put Santorini on the label, and this is due to the PDO laws of Greece.
Yep.
So just like other parts of the world, like in Europe, the wine regions of Greece are regulated by the EU and have certain laws that dictate what you can and cannot do. So in order to say Santorini on the label, it has to be at least 75% Assyrtiko. And then there are 2 other varieties that are allowed to be blended in. One is called Aithiri and one is called Aidani. And those are a little bit more lighter in style, maybe a little bit more fragrant, floral. But Assyrtiko is definitely the king. It's what gives it the body. It's what gives it the richness. It's what gives it the acidity and that minerality.
Right.
But it's definitely, you're seeing more and more 100% Assyrtiko wines, where in the past, it was more, the blend of 75% was just because that's what the majority of the vines that grew. And it was kind of like field blends that they would just take what was in their vineyards. And Paris Sagalis was one of the first, so for the wine, we're having one wine from Sagalis. He was one of the first winemakers to do 100% Assyrtiko. And that's become much more trendy and popular on the island. So now you're seeing lots of different producers focusing on just that one grape, because that's the grape that we think has the most potential. It has such an iconic characteristic, and it's definitely what people love. And it's starting to be, it's one of the grapes I think that gives Greece tremendous amount of recognition.
Right.
And it is indigenous. In Fonte, you do get a red wine. If you leave the Assyrtiko for, say, 24 to 48 hours, you begin to get a red from it. The trouble is it also begins to get a little bit sweet.
From the oxidation?
We called it brusco on the island, which is just a slang for red. It didn't ever really have a name. And also, obviously, you can make a sweet wine. Vinsanto was valued highly, we would take the Acertico grapes and dry them on our rooftops, which, by the way, were the only other ways we collected water. When it rained, the roofs are all runoffs to cisterns. And you should have seen me try to get a bucket out of the cistern the first time, which was a huge failure.
Oh.
And then press the essentially raisins into the Vinsanto, and you got this incredibly rich sweet wine. And to get an ancient Vinsanto out of the barrel there is a special treat.
Oh, I can only imagine. Vinsanto, which we can talk about in a bit, is a wine that I think is very special, but very limited. But the Italians have a little bit of a gripe with us because they also make a Vinsanto, but that's a discussion for another time. But so for the folks that are listening or who have joined us, who probably have never had a Sirtico or white wine from Santorini, obviously you get the question, well, what's it like? What would be your opinion, Johnny, as far as, and I don't like to kind of compare things. I don't like to compare wines from Greece from other wines from around the world, because it just doesn't do justice, because they're so unique in aromas and flavors and textures. But if you had to say, for our listening audience who haven't explored wines or white wines from Santorini, a Sirtico is basically a variety that produces wines in what fashion, as a preview for those that should be trying it?
Well, before taking my job with Diamond Wine Importers, I was a beverage director, and I did the wine as well for my family's restaurants in New York. And we dealt with all Greek restaurants.
Give us a plug about those restaurants.
So I was the general manager of Sia, which is in Manhattan on 57th and 11th Avenue, awesome. Which is like a very fresh, vibrant Greek restaurant and mainly Greek wine list. Then we also have Molivos, which is on 7th Avenue and 55th Street. Yeah, it's great. And we can't wait to reopen that once we're allowed to. We have the largest all Greek wine list, one of the largest all Greek wine lists in the country. And we started doing an all Greek wine list over about 20 years ago. So one of the first places to really focus on the wines. But the question you ask is a question you get almost every single day.
Right.
Because, when people have never had Greek wines before, they always want to know what to compare it to. So it's definitely difficult to compare it to any one grape because it is so unique. Mm-hmm. But for me, I feel like the best or closest comparison is white Burgundy. So if you have, especially Chablis, so if you have a Sirtico from Santorini that is aged in stainless steel without any oak at all, right, I feel like you're going to be able to compare it to wines from Chablis, which is made out of 100% Chardonnay. So the wines from Chablis in the northern France, they have a lot of limestone, chalky soil. They have that high acidity and high mineral content, and high body and ageability. So I think that's a really good comparison. There are a lot of really fantastic Asirticos that are barrel aged, and those I compare to white Burgundy, because in Burgundy, like south of Chablis, you're going to have a lot more barrel aged Chardonnays. Richness, a little bit of that oakiness. You could age it for 15 years. I mean, I had Santorini from Sagalis that was, from in the 90s. It's like, yes, it's an amazing experience because they have the high acidity. They could last in the bottle forever. And then the Vinsantos, like Susanna said, you could have those 100 years old. They could last forever.
And that's an important point that you mentioned, John, is if white wines are made well and they have high levels of acidity, they can age. Most folks think that, white wine only is around for a couple of years, but with the acidity levels, they can go for a lot longer.
Yeah, and sometimes they get better as they age, especially wines like I'd say the Santo Asirtico out of the two probably you need at least 2 or 3 more years before it's really perfect, because sometimes the acidity could be almost too aggressive or too acidic. You could feel your teeth start to get sensitive. And as it ages, it really starts to mellow, the flavors develop and change. And it creates a whole new experience that is really enjoyable.
It's stony. Some people would call it flaky. It's mineral.
Flinty.
It's incredible, obviously, with food. Did you know Chardonnay was also a Greek varietal originally from the area of Lebanon before it went up the Rhone Valley into France? So
the French agree to that.
Yeah, and the Greeks brought the wines everywhere.
Yeah, there's a wine from
Chateau kind of interesting when you talk about the blend of from Paris here, and it's a Monovasa with the Acertico.
Yeah.
That's Shakespeare's Malmsey wine. The English couldn't pronounce it, and they called it Malmsey. And
Really?
that is of Shakespeare. When you read about the people drinking Malmsey wine, it's from Greece.
Oh, wow.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that from now on.
That's awesome.
So this is great. I mean, we're getting history, we're getting firsthand knowledge from our experts, Johnny. But I think over the years, in the last 10 years at least, I think the wines from a quality and production level have evolved tremendously. Where unfortunately there was always this stigma before, folks were like really hesitant about Greek wine. It was either, in their opinion, it was either too sweet because of Mavrodaphne, or because they had this experience with a wine called Retsina.
Mhm.
And we're getting past that, and I don't hear it as much as I used to hear it before. And thanks to the efforts of our restaurateurs, like Johnny and his family and his associates and the rest of the restaurant groups around the country, I think that the efforts in Greece have come a long way, from farming to technology to equipment, to consulting, what have you, where now we're able to, we as Greeks, are able to match our wines with any international production that's out there at any level. And I think Santorini is very special because it really puts us on the map for serious winemaking, right, Johnny?
Oh, totally. And especially because they have the technology, they have the history, they have these classic grapes that don't grow anywhere else in the world. It's a perfect combination. And all it took was a few people to realize how special it really was, for them to be like, wait a second, we can't just let this sit around. We have to do something with this. And then take it to that next level. Yeah, and like you said, I feel like for decades, they didn't appreciate how good it was, how special their varieties are. And
Right.
there are hundreds of indigenous varieties all throughout Greece. And it was something they drank for themselves. They didn't really sell it to the rest of the world. And if they did, they sold it inexpensive, to sell it quickly.
True.
Other countries like France and Italy, they do a really good job, I think, of branding themselves. But Greece has that same or even better quality. And I think over the past few decades, you've seen them reinvest, learn, travel, work in other countries where they have maybe better winemaking techniques, and then applying that to the Greek terroir and the indigenous grapes. And that is why you've seen the quality really skyrocket, especially over the last 20 years.
Couple more little parts to that is a lot of the winemaking was hidden because of the Ottoman suppression.
Mm-hmm.
That was one. And then the other is you have to think and remember that Greece had to crawl its way back after World War II until they got the Marshall Plan, and they were slower at getting together and getting a market share than the other countries that did not have to go through such terrible turmoil after the war. And Greece had a much longer recovery than the other countries. And so by the time they got their fame and their names known and what they were producing, it was a little late to get their name known.
Mm-hmm.
Very good point, Susanna. Very good point. So why don't we talk a little about the wines that we actually want to feature in this webinar, get to know them a little bit more closely. And then actually, after we go through this, we can open up our segment to any of our participants on any questions that they have for us.
Sure. I'll quickly go through the two wines. So the first one is a Sirtigo Monevasia, like I said. So this is not a classic blend. And the Monevasia doesn't actually grow on Santorini, but it grows on the neighboring island. It's indigenous to the island of Paros. And what you're going to get was, we like to call it like an entry-level wine to a Sirtigo. Because Monevasia is a lot more lighter. It's a lot more fragrant and refreshing. So you're not going to have that crazy gripping acidity and full bodiness, but something you could maybe drink every day. Maybe you don't even need food with this. You could have this on its own. And Paris Sagalis, who founded the winery in 1991, he originally was a math teacher on the island. And he studied math in Paris. And that's where he really learned to appreciate wine. He went to grad school in Paris, in France. Moved back to Santorini, and he inherited some land from his family. And that's where he just started experimenting with the wines as a hobby. And once he realized, and his friends realized, that this stuff was so good, he quit teaching math and focused on this full time. And now he's probably one of the first producers on the island to really get that fame and recognition for a Sirtigo. So the wine here, it's aged in stainless steel tanks for just a few months. Again, I think you're going to get something that's very bright, very classic Assyrtiko style, that citrus, that minerality. But then you have the Monevasia that's giving it that fragrant, that freshness, and that lightness. And the average age of the vines in this wine are over 50 years old.
Now, Johnny.
Yeah.
Monevasia, the varietal. Any connection to Monevasia, the
Yes. Yeah, that's the Malmsey.
That's the Malmsey. But
yeah.
It
was shipped from Monevasia to England.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of different. There's a lot of different wines that have similar names, and they're definitely mostly related. Because I feel like a lot of those wines that have Malvasia, Monevasia, they all are very aromatic, and so I don't know exactly. Susanna probably knows better than me where they all came from, but there's a lot of links and similarities between a lot of those wines.
Well, in the ancient days, they preferred a sweet wine. And the Monevasia, the Malmsey wine, is a sweet all the way through England. It's also in ancient times, remember, they watered it down. The usual formula was 4-to-1, although you could get away with 3-to-1 with water. And then there was a famous wine called Thalassia, which was you did it in the full moon out in the ocean, out in the sea, and added salt water from the sea. And that was the origin of that. And the name is now used in you've seen it, I'm sure, in one of the Greek wines, which is a wonderful white wine. And one of my favorites is Kidonitsa, which has elements of quince and is named for quince. So, but originally the wines were sweeter. So we're talking here about a varietal that unless it was aged into Vinsanto, was a dry, flaky, stony wine, not the ways the ancients preferred it.
I can definitely, as I'm sipping, Johnny and Susanna, so this particular selection that has the Monevasia definitely brings out a more softer, little riper. It kind of rolls off your palate. Cineasas, for those of us, hopefully everyone's drinking, right? It doesn't have to be these wines as long as you're drinking. But as far as a selection for white, it's definitely easy to drink. It's got definitely plenty of flavor, in my opinion, very aromatic. But it does have some ripeness of like stone fruit versus what tastes the Assyrtiko after. But this is definitely, in my opinion, a wine that goes down a little too easy.
Right, that's dangerous. Yeah. Should I go on to the next one, or?
Yeah,
definitely. And then we'll have questions and after, for sure.
Yeah, so the next wine we have today is a classic 100% Assyrtiko from Santorini. So the winery here is called Santo Winery. And they are of tremendous importance on the island because they are the island's cooperative or co-op. So they were founded in 1947 as a union of Santorini cooperatives and represented all the wineries on Santorini. So today, Santo Wines is the biggest producer on the island. And they built a brand new winery in 1992, which is situated all the way on the top of the caldera in the village of Pyrgos. And if you go to Santorini, I highly recommend you visit it because it is on the top of the caldera. You have a beautiful view of the whole island, like a panoramic view of everything. And it's probably one of the most visited tourist destination on the island, just because it has an amazing view. It has a great restaurant. Has an awesome shop that sells not just wine, but other delicacies from the island, like capers, caper leaves, tomato paste, fava, which is the split peas that are indigenous to the island as well. Right. So there are a lot of different things in terms of food and gastronomy that come from the island. So the co-op, what they do is they buy grapes from the producers all over the island. So all the small farmers that have their land, they source and select the grapes from the small producers. And I feel like normally when you think of a co-op wine, you don't think of something that is as high quality as this. I think in terms of co-ops in general, this is one of the best quality co-op wines I've ever had. So they have a really great winemaking facility, great winemaker team. They're doing a really nice job there.
And they host a lot of events there, don't they?
Yeah, they do weddings there all the time. It's a beautiful
concerts.
Yeah.
I think Ari's going to share a photo shot of actually because they have, like you said, magnificent views of the winery itself because it overlooks the caldera.
Exactly. Yeah,
Uh,
it's gorgeous. You go there and you don't want to leave.
right. I've been there plenty of times, and like you said, once I get there, I just want to stay there for the rest of the day.
Yeah. So
And
you
if
got a
you have
perfect
a
view straight in the
chance to
center of
get
the caldera.
a Santos tomato paste, buy it and bring it back in
I
your
just finished
suitcase.
my jar.
It is the best tomato paste in the world. It's
Oh,
so rich, it's
Do you have
almost
any extra
black.
for us?
I use it in I make when I cook beans, I throw in a tablespoon of the tomato
Santos
paste,
tomato
a
paste.
bay leaf, some salt, and that's really all you need. It's so delicious.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's magical, the area, the winery itself, because where it's situated, you can't get a better view.
Yeah.
And the capers are wild. The
Yeah,
two,
wild
they're not domestic. They're
And
incredible.
one thing I never had before until I went to Santorini was pickled the jarred caper leaves.
Yeah.
They even jar and eat the leaves of the caper bushes, which are it's the most unique flavor I've ever had. It almost tastes like I mean olives and then like tobacco, or it has a lot of different flavors going on. It's
Wow,
really,
that's
really
wild.
Stuff them in a fish
yeah.
when you grill it. It's incredible. It's
Good to know. I'm going to keep that in mind.
Yeah. So back to the wine. So
Oh yeah, back to Assyrtiko.
Yeah, so the wine is 100% Assyrtiko. It's about 13.5% alcohol, and it's 100% aged in stainless steel. But you're gonna get really the classic acidity here. On the front of the label, we call it volcanic terroir because you might get even a little bit of that smokiness or flintiness, gunpowder aroma of the minerals that come from the volcanic soil. It's really full-bodied, rich, and intense. So it's something that you probably it'd serve you best to have this wine with a meal. Whereas maybe the first one, you can have it on its own, no problem. And the first one does really great with food too.
Well,
But
the
this
first
one,
bottle is on its own. The second bottle is with food.
yeah, the second bottle definitely with food. If you have like a piece of grilled fish, it's some octopodi or a lot of different types of dishes. But I think a perfect pairing is a grilled bronzino with the caper berries on the side, with the glass of this Assyrtiko. You're gonna love it. And the best thing about it is that price point for the quality of the wine. I mean, the wines from Santorini have definitely increased in price over the last few years. But think about everything we just said. The island's tiny. There's only about 14 or 15 producers on the island. The grapes are old and ancient, so they don't even make that much juice. And all together, the wines do cost a lot, and they are rare to produce. But when you compare it to wines from Burgundy, you're still paying half the price for something that is just as good or equal or better in quality.
Very
So
good point.
keep in mind. I think the Foti, how much were you selling the Santo for?
So the Santo Assyrtiko is something that actually retails for $24.99.
See? Yeah, that's amazing. $24.99. I feel like for if you had the same style of wine from France, it'd probably be like $40 or $40.
I was going to say at least double, but yeah, I totally agree. So for us, this is still value, and I get it. Wines that are in the $20 range, some folks might be a little hesitant, but once you try it, you'll understand why it's worth it.
Yeah. For us, it's difficult to raise prices because people are always like, I remember when I had that wine 3 years ago and it was $18.95. And it's like, unfortunately, things become more.
A lot has happened since 3 years ago.
Yeah, a lot has happened. Exactly. So, we don't want to, we can't raise prices too much. We want to be fair to everyone, to our customers, and give you that value that we all love to share.
So back to the two wines, two very exceptional selections, one coming from an iconic winemaker, Cigales, who I'm a big fan of, anything that he puts out. Santo Winery, again, another exceptional operation. They do everything well, in my opinion, and we're very grateful that people like yourselves, Johnny, and Diamond Imports can actually bring wine to this market for us to enjoy because of it. So, if you think about it, Santorini has how many residents who live there all year round, for example? Less than 10,000?
Yeah, it's not a lot.
And then from the statistic that I get from the National Tourist Organization is that there's about 1.2 plus million visitors that walk through that island every year, right?
Yeah.
So they need wine there for their domestic consumption along with the tourist industry. So then besides that, then there's a little bit left over for us here in this market. So I think we're very grateful that we can still at least get some of this production here in the U.S. that we can enjoy, because I don't know how often we can fly to Santorini and have a quick bite or hang out for a weekend or for the week. But, you know, I'm very grateful that we're able to get these wines here to this market. It makes me also very proud, being in the wine industry, that, you know, we get to taste so many great wines around the world. And here we are with our selections from Santorini that actually matches up with any high reputable region that makes, you know, the best, quote unquote, the best wines around. Maybe we can, Ari, at this point, we can open up if any of our listeners or our attendees want to ask questions to our special guests, because for us, this is a treat to have both Dr. Susanna Hoffman and Johnny Livanos in one space together. Often enough, I do connect and communicate with Johnny or Susanna separately, but this for us is a big treat. So we want to leave the floor open to anyone that wants to ask any questions for us.
Patrick Walsh actually wanted to know, you mentioned earlier that some Acítico wines are aged in barrels. Can we find some of them in the U.S. market?
Yes, I mean, so we import a couple, mainly from Domaine Sagalis. He makes a fantastic barrel-aged Acítico. It's something that we bring in a very limited amount of. So, you know, if you want to reach out to me, I could, my email is johnny@Diamond Wine Importers, and I could do my best to try to find someone who has it for you. Also, one other producer we represent is called Vasaltis on Santorini, and they make also a fantastic barrel-aged Acítico. But those we just bring in a very limited amount, so it might be hard to find even for me. Maybe Foti has some in his stash somewhere.
We'll communicate, and maybe we can help Patrick out, and we'll get a selection for him to try.
But you can get Sagalis fairly easily. Besides, you know, too. I mean, it's one of the few ones that gets he's recognized. So, but yeah, his stuff is great.
Excellent. Ari, anyone else have any questions for us?
One thing I wanted to mention, you said how hard it is to get some of these wines. 80% of all Greek wines produced is consumed in Greece. So the leftover 20% goes to the rest of the world. Right. So sometimes you got to think about that. Like we're competing with every other country out there to make sure we can supply our fans with such special wines.
And I think compared to the rest of the world who produces wine, Greece, a small country, production levels are relatively lower than most countries. So if you put that into perspective, you know, it's very special that the little amount of wine that we can get access to for us is a blessing.
It's got very, very high ratings, Greek wine, over the last number of years, and all of the columns, the wine columns, and they're noticing, they're recognizing, they're giving incredibly high marks to Greek wine. And so they've started part of the scramble.
Right. Cool. Ari, you got anything for us?
Let me unmute myself. Thank you, Foti and team. Is there an optimal time from vintage to drink a 100% Acítico? Also love Chateau Moussard, and wondering what comment Gianni was going to make about it.
Oh, because Susanna was mentioning how Chardonnay originated from the Lebanon region, and Chateau Moussard, he makes these blends with like Chardonnay and other varieties like Obadi, and I forget the other one. I had this at a Lebanese restaurant, and he makes these iconic wines from Lebanon. He's one of the only a few producers there. So I was just going to say to just kind of piggyback off what Susanna was saying, how Chardonnay originated there. And if you have the chance to have the Chateau Moussard wines, he's producing some of these awesome Lebanese wines.
Big fan of him.
Yeah.
And there's some thought that Sangiovese is an Agrietico. You know, that's.
I hope we can prove that. That'd be great if we can prove that there's a connection.
Yeah.
So I mean, the Greeks brought their wines all over the Mediterranean. So, and certainly the Moscow, the sweet wines, of all the islands and stuff and across the Mediterranean are Greek-based.
And Johnny, as far as Vinsanto goes, obviously it's very rare and very limited. But as far as availability, I did come across a little bit of Cigales' Vinsanto, but does that seem to possibly get a little better in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, the Vinsantos age forever. And I think that, you know, some of them age, at least they have to be aged. I think most of them are aged 3 years in a barrel before being bottled. Plus then, like Susanna was saying, the grapes are dried out. So by drying them out in the sun, the grapes are very concentrated with the sugars, but they still have the classic of high acidity. So what you end up getting is a high sugar, but also high acidic wine. So it tastes balanced. It's not just very sweet like other dessert wines. You have that acidity, which balances the sugar, which makes it such a pleasant experience. And yeah, you could age them for a while. I had one recently that was, I think, 25 years old, and it was so phenomenal. Those are really, they're pretty expensive because you think about basically the amount of juice it takes to make one bottle because the grapes are so.
For our listening folks, for those of you that are not familiar with Vinsanto, it's basically a production that's made from grapes that have been dried out to almost like raisins, right?
Yes.
And
squeezing the juice out of a raisin.
Imagine trying to squeeze juice out of a raisin to make wine, in a sense. So it is a long process. It's a delicate process. So there's a lot of labor involved, and the yield is very low as well. So they're very special wines, and unfortunately, they do have a higher price point. But the second you take a sip of a Vinsanto, in my opinion, it's heaven.
I have a couple of questions coming in. If you guys want to...
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Patrick Wallace wants to know which months of the year is the harvest in Greece?
So typically, it's in the end of summer, like around August.
It's early.
So like mid-August, and I think August 15th, isn't there a harvest holiday for us? Or is it around there? And after?
I think it's the Panairi, right?
Well, it's the Panairi, August 15th. Yeah, it's St. Mary's Day.
Yep.
St. Mary's. And I think from that point on, depending on where you are in Greece, harvest begins.
Exactly.
Yep. So yeah, so
Santorini, it's early.
I have one more. I have a couple more.
The more the better, because I have a whole bottle to finish. No, 2 bottles.
And then traveling to Santorini for vineyard visits.
Can you repeat the question? You kind of cut off.
Sorry. When do you recommend traveling to Santorini for vineyard visits?
So the peak time in Greece is summertime, June to August. However, I went to Santorini in April, and I took this picture in April. There's no one there, but you still have all the beautiful restaurants and hotels are open. It's less expensive to get a room. I had an amazing time in April. When my grandparents go to Greece, they go in May. So I might try to, it depends if you don't like crowds, maybe try to avoid the peak summer months. Also, then there's more likelihood to get a reservation at a vineyard. And then probably the same too at the end of the summer. Like if you're there in September, you might be seeing some of the winemaking being done. But for me, one of the things that was so special, as a kid growing up, we always went to Greece in the summer. Going there in the spring, we get this. I never seen so many flowers in Greece. Like Greece is a very dry country, but to go in the spring, you see wildflowers growing everywhere. And that to me was such a unique and special experience. So I'd say, there's no wrong time to go. I think starting in spring and then throughout the summer is probably best. But definitely you probably want to avoid like July, August peak tourism time, because then you're just, it's a tiny island with thousands and thousands of people on these small cobblestone roads. So, it depends on your preference of crowds.
I'll get in on that. I mean, if you go in April or May, Santorini is covered in daisies and poppies, absolutely covered, and there very little tourism started by then. Though it's warm enough, it begins to get warm enough to swim. Of course, you can always go out to the volcano and swim too, where it's warm. I don't go after the end of May, because of they get as many as 9 or 10 huge tourist boats a day. So you're really fighting the crowds nowadays. It's kind of, they're complaining about it and are beginning to talk about limiting the number of cruise ships that they're allowing. I go again from, I'd say, September 20th to maybe October 20th. It gets a little blustery by the end of October. You might see a little rain, certainly some wind, but it's also delightful. They're kind of closing down. The people are recovering from having the tourist season, and it's delightful. The people are delightful everywhere. There's also unique foods throughout, especially the tomato cafetes, tomato patties, and obviously the fava, which, you know, I have pictures of people grinding that, which we ate every day. So there's unique foods as well to be had on the island.
Excellent. Another question. Drake Barakis, I don't know if you guys ever heard of him, but this guy named Drake. How would you compare winery tours in Greece to USA and France?
Oh, well, the biggest comparison is that in Greece, you don't really have those, you know, mega mansion estates like you do in, say, Napa Valley, where it's like, you know, a Disneyland of wine. I think in Greece, the wine tourism is growing, and you have a handful of estates that are really beautiful and welcome tourists and maybe have restaurants, but they're not at the level of like grandois as maybe the Napa wines or the Burgundy like chateaus, or Bordeaux chateaus. So you're going to get more, I think, a genuine Greek experience. It's going to be a little more, and it depends. You could go to a place like, you know, Domaine Skouras in the Peloponnese, which is a very beautiful chateau, very beautiful estate. Or you could go to a place like, or like, you know, the Santo winery there. It's a pretty beautiful production. It's a nice place. But then you could go to a small, tiny winemaker's house where, you know, they might serve you lunch. You get like a very intimate experience. So I'd say the biggest comparison would be it's much more intimate. It's much more low key. You have to kind of stray off the beaten path a bit to find some of these vineyards or wineries, because, you know, the big cities are, you know, there's not that many wineries near the big cities in Greece, versus, you know, if you're going to Napa or in the United States or in France or Italy, there's tremendous amount of the wines are all kind of like the tourist destinations to see.
You can do a wine tour in Santorini. There are wine tours in Santorini. It's a lovely way to not only drink wine, but to see probably 10 or 12 of the 14 villages. And they will point out some of the better restaurants. There's an incredible one behind one of the oldest Byzantine churches near Pyrgos. There are down by the two beach towns, Parissa and Kamari. But the tour would take you more to Emborion, which was one of the 5 capitals. There were 5 capitals on Santorini, 5 trading capitals, and remnants of them still remain. It wasn't just one main town, there were 5. So you can do a wine tour on Santorini itself, and it's a lovely experience, and I recommend it highly. Tourist office in town will sell you tickets on them, and I'll pick you up.
One of my other favorite areas for wine tourism are the islands of Crete, as well as all the way in the northern part of Greece and Nausa. They're just such great places with a lot of small wineries, and they do.
I like Nemea.
Yeah, and Nemea is great too. Nemea is awesome. If you go to Nemea, you could stay at the town of Nafplio, which was the original capital of Greece and before Athens, and then you could go to a lot of wineries in Nemea which produce fantastic red wine called Aioritiko, and there's a lot of different wineries there. But staying in Nafplio is my favorite because it's a really nice village with a castle on the top. So, you know, I think Greek wine tourism is amazing because you experience Greece first, and then you also experience the wine.
Yeah, and Nemea was the second biggest Olympics.
Yeah.
They were the second biggest games. And of course, Hercules, you know, he had to kill the lion of Nemea, right?
Yeah.
I have another question. Do you store Vinsanto in order to age upright or laying down the bottle?
Most wine, pretty much all wine, should be stored on its side. It prevents the cork from drying out and having issues long term. But I'd say after you open the bottle of Vinsanto, it probably would still stay good for a little while. And after you open it, just keep it in the fridge upright.
Excellent. All right. One more. No, two more.
Yeah, keep going.
What is the average size of the different vineyards in Santorini?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know specifically about Santorini, but I know in Greece, the average winery is like only an acre, like a couple acres or two in Greece. In Santorini, it's probably must be about the same. They like
Well, hectares, it's
like about
hectares.
5 hectares. So yeah, it's like 3 to 5 hectares. So like about 1 to 2 acres, I'd say. I always have a hard time converting acres to hectares, but
I can do the math.
The great winemakers like Sigalis, and Sigalis is one of the 5 or 6 last names of Santorini, they will buy the wine from other small villagers. Like the village I live in, it was a very small village, and people only have a few fields or a few areas where they grow wine. And if they're not making their own, then Sigalis will get to cultivate, will buy their grapes.
Right.
Excellent. Okay, one more. So I found some acíticos, such as Ariros, increasingly difficult to find. Do you expect acítico in general to be more difficult to find going forward? If so, Poti, I'll see you in a week.
I feel like it's like a two-sided question. In one end, Assyrtiko is becoming more popular. So in that end, I feel like it's going to be easier to find, because I think in terms of restaurants, wine bars, or wine shops, if they're going to have one wine from Greece, it's going to be Assyrtiko. So in that end, I think it might be easier to find. But as it becomes more popular, there is more competition. But I don't think we're at a point yet where the wines are so rare that there isn't enough to go around. So I think over time, hopefully it actually should be easier. But, people like Foti who specialize in this stuff, you could always count on him for having a good amount of Assyrtiko stocked up.
Yeah, so I'm your go-to Assyrtiko guy.
Yeah. And, there are Assyrtikos becoming more popular throughout Greece too. So they're starting to grow the variety outside of Santorini into other parts like in Crete
Right.
or in northern Greece. So the grape always has those high acidity and high acidity is like and citrus notes is the main characteristics, but it has to come from Santorini to give it that like powerful minerality and smokiness that you can't get that anywhere else.
Awesome. All right. I think that's it for questions. That was, from somebody who is technically not the wine person out of this group. I learned a lot. Like, I learned so much. Even talking to you guys before the webinar, I learned so much, and it was so interesting listening to all of you. And you guys are really, really, really knowledgeable on your stuff. And I just want to say, I feel like I speak on behalf of everybody that's in here. So great. It makes me so proud to be Greek. It makes me so proud to drink Greek wines. And it was so entertaining and interesting to listen to all of this. And I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to the hosts who brought their knowledge and shared it with us. Thank you to all the participants out there listening. Just thank you all. Thank you all.
And if I can add, Ari, as well, I'm very grateful that we were able to bring such dear and interesting guests to our program. That for those of you that probably did not have the chance to pick up the wines prior to this segment, if you visit our platform, GreekWineClub.co, we do have all these wines available on our platform for ordering. We do delivery, we do shipping. You can always call us for recommendations. You can email us for recommendations, or if you have any questions. But our biggest goal is to be the voice, at least one outlet for the voice of Greek wines, so that people can actually learn and understand a little bit more about the Greek wine culture. And that's why we put these segments together, so we can bring interesting folks that we believe have some kind of influence that can make the experience better for the end user. And I want to personally thank Susanna and Johnny for taking the time out of their busy schedules to be with us, because for us it's an honor to be able to bring you to this platform together. And I just wanted to say, thank you so much for being a part of this today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Definitely. And I'm sure this is not the only time. I'm sure we'll definitely get you back on with us with upcoming segments based on the theme and what we're trying to promote and collaborate.
Actually, I'm going to plug Johnny for our Kriti.
Yes, we got an upcoming segment with, go ahead, Ari.
Yeah. Johnny, I love it when you talk. You speak so well. You're a handsome guy because somebody said we look alike, so I'm just going to say handsome guy.
I thought he was the Greek Ryan Reynolds. What happened to that? But
yes, and another plug. We have the Greek Ryan Reynolds over here because he has the, correct me if I'm wrong, the only Greek gin?
No, not the only. We're one of a handful, but we're the second Greek gin.
The best one.
I think the best one. Yeah. Thank you.
So, yeah.
We'll be in Massachusetts, available in Massachusetts, hopefully very soon.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's my nickname for you, the Greek Ryan.
And I also want to make a plug, since we're on the segment. One of our Phil Hellenes was with us, Patrick Walsh, who is a dear friend of ours, who's a wine lover, who will be also joining us in an upcoming segment, who's from Provence Wine Imports, does a fantastic job bringing wines from Provence. We're going to be also featuring another segment with Patrick Walsh on July 16th and another segment. So just, look out for the information, because we'd love for you to join us at that time as well, because we want to thank everyone that's joining us today as well.
All right, so thank you again. Stay tuned for the Kriti wine webinar with Johnny Livanos. Thank you so much, Susanna. You had unbelievable information for us. Foti, I'll see you like in 5 minutes. So
right. And Susanna and Johnny, before we end this, this is like, as we're doing this, we should put together some kind of a wine tour in Greece together as a package.
I'd love to do that.
Right?
I would love to talk about.
Hopefully, our listening audience would be interested, and we can give us some feedback. But I'd love to put this together.
Definitely, I could help arrange with the wineries for sure.
Perfect.
I can talk about the history and the archaeology and the culture for weeks.
As long as there's food there, I'm in. Excellent. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate that. Follow us on all of our handles, Greek Wine Club. We greatly thank you. We love you. And please stay tuned for our upcoming segments.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Susanna.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you, everybody, for tuning in. Have a great night. Stay safe. And goodbye.